once said, the key to profitable ranching is keeping it simple. The challenge to profitable ranching is keeping it simple. We make this very complex, and the more complex we make it in our minds, the more challenging and least profitable it becomes. We're going to think about factors that are the really big ones, the important ones when it comes to profit in the cattle business. And most of what I'm saying applies equally well to the sheep also. Goats, I'm not quite as positive about where they all come in. But, we could sit around and talk about things that we believe might be affecting profit. And, computer modeling is a big thing. But there is also something that's called BOGSAT modeling. And BOGSAT modeling, if you don't know what BOGSAT is it's a bunch of guys sitting at a table where, we just talk about this stuff. And so, there's just some, words written there that may be important when it comes to determining the profitability of your business. Some are more important than others. People have a lot of misperceptions about what's important. In the 80s, the big project of the IRM committee was a record-keeping system called SPA, Standardized Performance Appraisal. And SPA was supposed to become the record-keeping system that everybody in the beef industry used so that we could compare ourselves across the industry, look at, how did we stack up in, our state or our county. And of course, like all of these great endeavors, it never really came to pass that it was used by everybody in the beef industry. But there was a time in the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s where SPA was a good database. And I use a lot of SPA information. And this particular one is from the state of Illinois, and it includes 158 cow-calf herds. And so that's where the data analysis is coming from, 158 cow-calf herds in Illinois. And the committee, they were BOGSAT modeling and thinking about, well, what are factors that could be affecting profitability? And in this particular group, I believe there were 26 different parameters that, they said, well, this might be affecting profitability. And then we can do, and in this case, it was, I think referred to it earlier, stepwise modeling, where you take those 26 parameters and you start sorting out by what percent of the variation in this characteristic is explained from here. And the characteristic we're looking at is profitability in the cow-calf business. And so in this, they started with 26 parameters in the model. I have the top 8, statistically, the top 8 factors affecting profitability in these cow-calf operations in Illinois. And here's the really interesting one. 57% of the variation in profitability across all of these operations is explained just by feed costs. It is the difference in your feed cost that determines whether or not you're more or less profitable. And analysis over the last 40 years from many different states, from the industry as a whole, it always comes back to this. It's feed costs. And in these various analyses, usually will run somewhere between 50 and 70% of the variation in profitability is attributable to feed cost. That's a pretty big deal. Now, what do most of your neighbors talk about at the coffee shop this time of year? weaning weight. Well, they might be talking about corn yields, but if they're cattle producers, they're probably talking about weaning weights and bragging about their weaning weights and how important that is. The fifth item down on this list is weaning weight. And less than 5% of the variation in profitability across these cow-calf enterprises is attributable to weaning weight. I'm going to say pretty confidently that in the last 30 years, maybe up to 40 years, but for sure the last 30 years, I have not seen one of these analyses that has weaning weight at anything more than 10% of a factor for determining profitability. 4 to 7% is where it usually shows up. Now, let's think about early January. There's a couple of things that start showing up in your mail in early January. What are those? Your tax forms and all the bull sale catalogs. It's a cold winter evening. You're there in your comfy chair by the wood stove, and you have the choice of looking at your accounting records and working on your taxes or looking at bull catalogs. What are you going to look at? Bull catalogs. That's so much more interesting. And, we start looking at the weaning weight EPDs and, we're thinking about this bull that we're going to get because we want to up our weaning weight a little bit more. That basically says it's 10 times more important to be looking at your cost accounting records than it is to shop for bulls. Because cost management is what's going to help you change the profitability of your business, not the particular bull that you pick out this year. What is the second most important determinant of profitability according to that list? It says depreciation cost. This is not cow depreciation. This is equipment and facility depreciation. I think I said yesterday that most people are overcapitalized in equipment. There's only so much a cow can pay for, and most people have more stuff than a cow or a herd of cows is ever going to pay for. And according to this analytic, it is the second biggest determinant of profitability. What is your equipment and facility investment per cow? I want to drop to the bottom one. So this is the number 8 item. And at 0.007, that's less than 1%. And that is herd size. Maybe you've been told, get big or get out. You got to have 300 cows to be profitable. That's not accurate according to this. Less than 1% of the variation in profitability could be attributed simply to the size of your herd. As I pointed out yesterday, Burke Tykert said small herds can be very profitable if you have all of those other business practices properly lined out. There's almost nowhere in the United States where agricultural land is priced based on its agricultural productivity. Development value, recreational value, scenery, that is what drives the price of most agricultural land in the country. The idea that you can buy land from the agricultural products coming from that land is just about a myth. There's just very, very few situations where you can actually pull that off these days. I'm going to say from 2027 to probably 2030, cow depreciation will replace feed cost as the biggest line item in the cow-calf budget. Because of the high price of cows right now, that value of cows is going to go down when we start repopulating the national herd. Right now, a cull cow, going to the processor can bring over $2,000. A cull cow 4 to 5 years ago, $1,000 plus or minus. A cull cow 4 or 5 years from now, is probably going to be something a little better than $1,000. I'm going to say $1,200. So you pay $3,000 for a cow right now, and 4 years from now, you're going to sell her as a cull for $1,200. My math says that's an $1,800 loss on your investment. And as I said, we'll look at that in detail. The last cattle cycle price peak we had was 2013, 2014, and right on cue from 2017 to about 2020, cow depreciation replaced feed costs as the highest cost of being in the cow-calf business. This happens every cattle cycle. The cattle cycle is alive and well, and this collapse in cow value, it's just over the horizon. So for most cow-calf producers, that is their biggest line item cost. And unfortunately, most of your neighbors do not know what it costs them to get to that point of putting hay back out to those cattle. They don't know what the cost of production is. They don't know what the cost of feeding it is. And they probably aren't thinking about what is the opportunity cost of making hay. I am very interested in trying to stay up to date on what is happening within the industry. And LMIC, if you want a source of accurate financial information for not only the beef industry, but sheep, hogs, chickens, all of that, LMIC is the source that I use. Oh, there it is, Livestock Marketing Information Center. Yeah. Okay. So I think these are the most reliable numbers for the cost to, carry a beef cow. And another individual that I'll identify is Neville Spear, Nevillspeer. Neville Spear is my go-to guy. I think he is the best beef economist in the United States currently. So this is the average annual cost to carry a cow, and this line starts in 1996, and this was compiled in 23. So in 2023, that cost to carry a cow, and if you look at that, this is total cash cost plus pasture rent. This is not with overheads and all that. It is cash costs and pasture rent. 2023 is the first time that went over $1,000 a cow in this country. And it was at 1088. Now, for whatever reason, LMIC projected that in 24 and 25, the costs were going to come down. And they were wrong, because we, of course, don't have 2025 numbers yet because the year isn't over. But one LMIC and another one of the reports, in 2024, that cost went to $1,143 per cow. That's out-of-pocket operating costs. That's pretty dang scary. Yeah, for a 500-pounder, we were running around $2 a calf back then, and we thought it was a wonderful price, didn't we? We thought it was a wonderful price. So $1,200, and I'm just using that, let's put it at $1,200 4 or 5 years ago. Today, that calf would barely pay the operating costs. It's not paying you any salary back, depreciation costs, the taxes, or anything like that. The value of that calf, and I would cheerfully go along with $500 because it would make my illustration, even more potent. Yeah. Sometime over the horizon, and they're probably not going to go to as low a price as what they were in 2020, but going to be worth a lot less than they are today. Back when we had that peak, 2013, 2014, the last peak in the cattle cycle, So the value of cattle, the last time it was really high. Isn't it interesting that our cost of production just rose right up to basically match that peak? And then when cattle prices declined, our cost of production fell off some, but it never falls back to where it was earlier. And we're going to see that same kind of pattern, over the next 4 or 5 years. Through my career at the University of Missouri, when we talked about stuff like that, we could pretty consistently say that it would cost you $300 to $400 to carry a cow. And that range, that goes all the way back basically to 1980. 1980, it got over $300, and then it stayed from 1980 to 2000, basically in that $300 to $400 range. And then since we got into the 21st century, we have been steadily creeping upward. Ethanol mandate and drought is what drove that up from 2006 up to the peak in 2013 there. And when cattle prices fall, we typically see a slight drop in that cost of production, but you know what? We get in the habit of doing things. Profit, very simple concept, income minus costs. So if we think about the revenue side of this equation, you can increase units of production. So in our conversation, that brings us back to the concept of carrying capacity and stocking rate. If we're going to try to increase units of production, that means increase stocking rate, we need to have the carrying capacity to support it. So if we're going to try to increase our revenue stream by more production, we have to make our land more productive. We can get a higher price per unit. The difference between selling food and selling commodities. That's a big price differential. Adding enterprises, multi-species grazing, fitting some other livestock enterprise in here without adding tremendously to the cost, but adding another livestock enterprise that's going to capitalize on an unused part of our resource base. Brush in the case of goats, weeds in the case of sheep. The pasture poultry stacked onto the grazing enterprise. So we can increase revenue or we can decrease costs. And ideally, what we would like to do, as you might imagine, is increase revenue while reducing costs. And there are ways that can happen. Under the cost category, we have two types of costs. We have the operating costs and overhead costs. Classic economists tend to call operating costs variable costs because they change with whatever the level of production is that we're operating at. And the overheads, they tend to call fixed costs. I do not like the term fixed costs because I don't believe any cost is fixed. In Ranching for Profit 35 years ago, I learned to say overheads instead of fixed costs. We change the business model, and very often we change or eliminate certain overhead costs. That's why to me they aren't fixed. With both of these operating costs and overhead costs, we cannot manage them if we do not know what they are. So variable costs, as I say, these are things that change with the level of production. Livestock purchase is the obvious one. If we buy 150 yearlings instead of 100, we're going to have approximately a 50% increase in operating cost in the ownership of that yearling. And anything we do with livestock purchase with yearlings, because we're basically turning them over in a single season, that is an operating cost. Investment in a breeding herd can be viewed as an overhead. Not everybody does, some people do, but investment in a breeding herd where you expect to have those animals over a extended number of years. Livestock purchase, some people will consider it an overhead. When we get to the cow depreciation section, you'll see why I consider it an operating cost. When we're assessing our finances, called gross margin analysis, that's the first evaluation we do. Gross margin is the difference between the value of your product and the operating cost to produce it. The gross margin ratio is what is that dollar value of your gross margin divided by the value of the product. All right, so if our variable cost for maintaining cows is $1,120, so that's kind of consistent of where we are right now. I have the calves valued at $1,800 because I made this slide, several months ago before they became, $2,500. So the gross margin is $680. It's the $1,800 value of our calf minus the $1,120 cost to carry. And if some of you are real economists and you're suddenly wanting to split hairs, this is not how we actually would compute it, because we do it. This is to show how it's done very simply. But we look at what is the revenue stream of a cow. The revenue stream of each cow unit on your property is a share of the calf crop, a share of the cull cow income, and a share of cull bull income. So there is more revenue per cow than simply its calf. And not every cow actually earns the value of a weaned calf, because not every cow has a calf. When we get into, deeper details, actually working, with your operation and what you're doing. So now we look at the gross margin ratio. And when I talk about gross margin should be greater than 50%, it is the gross margin ratio. So in this case, we would want to have a gross margin of at least $900. If the gross margin were $900, we would be sitting there at 50% ratio. To have a gross margin of $900, we would have to bring our operating cost down from $1,120 per cow to $900 per cow. And so there's your question. How are you going to cut $220 out of your operating cost? And this is where we would start the conversation in a consulting visit with a ranch that is currently not operating at the financial level that we want it to be. We start with the gross margin analysis, figure what do we have to get rid of in order to get our gross margin ratio to something greater than 50%. When you look at it from this scenario and you think about, all right, if I had the choice of getting $100 additional revenue or spending $100 less in operating costs, which is actually more favorable to my bottom line of return to assets? And it is save $100 in expenses. Is going to help the percentage return on assets more than adding $100 of revenue is going to do. And so until you get gross margin ratio over 50%, your focus needs to be, how do I reduce costs, not how do I increase production? Another way I express it is, if you have 100 cows and you're losing $200 on every head, is having 120 cows going to fix your problem? Probably not. Overhead costs are the ones that we incur regardless. This is the classic definition. Regardless of the level of production, these are costs that you incur. Now, my experience has told me that overhead costs actually do change depending on the scale of operation. And we'll see some of those details. So things that come On the overhead side are land ownership, labor, and that would be your salary and any paid monthly wages. Those go in as overheads. One place where I differ with ranching for profit is on day labor. I put day labor as a operating cost rather than an overhead, because if you weren't doing this particular enterprise, why would you be hiring someone on a day-to-day basis to help you with that? And so to me, day labor is an operating cost. For ranching for profit, it still goes into their overhead size. And then we have the equipment facility depreciation, utilities, insurance, taxes. And then I have cow depreciation with an asterisk there. Because some people put it in as an overhead. I do not. I view cow depreciation as an operating cost. All right, so overhead ratio then becomes how much of your total cost of production is coming from the overhead side of this. And then the ratio is overheads divided by gross income. All right, so RMC is Ranch Management Consultants. That's the parent organization of the Ranching for Profit schools. And if you go to a Ranching for Profit class, they'll tell you overhead ratio needs to be less than 50%. And I've never understood that, because if you have a gross margin of 50% and an overhead ratio of 50%, what do you have? You have a break-even business, because all of your costs, or excuse me, you have enough costs that it is consuming the total value of your product. 50% is an operating cost, 50% is an overhead cost. So if you use that 50% target, you're setting yourself up, I think, to just be in a break-even position. And because I have looked so hard at so many people's overhead records, my position is we want overhead ratio to be less than 33%. So on that 18, we've got the calculation coming up here. All right, so we talked about the income per cow as being $1,800. We figured overheads at 540 in this example. So that's a 30% overhead ratio. This ranch certainly has a chance of surviving because the overhead ratio is low enough. Obviously, $600 overhead would put you at the 33% benchmark. So if you did overhead accounting and you found that you had $740 in overheads, that tells you right now that the profitability of your ranch is at jeopardy. And so we would strive to see how can we get our overheads reduced from this $740 per cow down to something less than $600. So this table here, I've got labor, land, facilities, equipment, utilities, and then total overhead costs. And we're going from a herd size of 0 all the way up to 500. So we have a property that, if effectively managed, we could run 500 cows on it. If somebody bought this who is buying a recreational ranch and they have no interest in raising livestock on it, they're just going to have a wildlife paradise and they're going to hunt and fish and, off-road on it and stuff like that. You're going to have a caretaker there. We're assigning some cost to the use of the land. That isn't the fair market value or a return on investment of it. It's just a fee for using that land. Facilities, there's going to be something there even if we're running no cows. Equipment, we got a tractor and a loader to do, maintenance around the place. There's going to be a utility bill. And so there's a cost of $96,000 running no animals at all. And then as we start increasing the numbers, some of these overheads are staying the same, but we'll see some of them do go up. If overheads includes salary and wages, and you go from running 50 cows to running 500 cows, it's going to cost you more. Even if this is money, that you're earmarking saying, okay, this is my salary from being on here, you're going to spend more time dealing with 500 cows than you are 50 cows, so you need to be paid a little more. We have the land fee fixed because that's just our rental for having this property. But you'll see facilities goes up, equipment goes up, utilities, they're all going up there. And again, this is why I don't call them fixed costs. Because as we have increased the animal number, we have added to some of these costs. So we've gone from a overhead cost of $96,000 with no animals on the place to $150,000 because now we're running 500 cows. Let's talk about land a little bit. I've already said there's no place in the country where you can buy land based strictly on its agricultural value. Now, more productive land does generally cost more per acre than less productive land. So this acres per cow, this is a measure of productivity of the land. And these are, several years out of date on this pricing. But at the time, I made this slide. This is what different land might be costing per acre. So if we take the acres required per cow times the value of the land, we end up with land cost per cow. And, it's kind of gradually going up there, stabilizing, and it might fall down. The point to make here is this isn't a linear response. You can't automatically presume that if you pay more per acre for land, it's going to cost you more to run cows there because the land is more productive. You can't buy the cheapest land there is and say, well, that's going to be the least expensive place to run cows because here's this $600 an acre and it takes 20 acres to carry a cow. That's a $12,000 investment per cow. Well, here's really productive land and it's costing us less on a per cow basis to be on that more productive land. So just understand that there's not a linear relationship between carrying capacity and the investment that you're going to make per cow for land base. I used to do stuff like this and try to figure out, okay, what is the maximum that I can invest per cow in a ranch and have it pay off? I meet people who aren't from a ranching background, they're from a business background. Midlife crisis hits, they decide, they need to own a Western ranch somewhere. And, they want to know what kind of return on investment can they expect, what can they charge the neighbor rancher for leasing it. And this just takes all of these investment per cows, looks at a return on investment. And if we were to say that, $100 is the most that we could afford, to charge against our cow for the land, 1% return on investment at these lowest investment costs. We get all the way out here and we're looking at, high hundreds into thousands of dollars. That's the rental rate that you would have to charge to make, a 10% return on investment, $1,400 per cow just for land use. There's nobody going to do that. At today's even at today's market, that's not going to work. And so an idea of an outside investor buying ranch land expecting rental to pay for that land. You can do that with commercial real estate in the city, but in the ranch world, that doesn't work. I firmly believe, and again, this is something I took home from Ranching for Profit a long time ago, is land ownership and ranching operations are two very separate businesses. I don't think I have a slide in here that says this. Some people think to get into the ranching business, the first thing they have to do is buy a piece of property. Land ownership is not a prerequisite for profitable ranching. To me, land ownership is the reward that you receive after I don't want to say life, but after doing your time in profitable ranch operations. If you start out by buying land, very often you have no financial reserves or leverage to stock that property, to do any improvements to it. All you have is a millstone around your neck because you bought that property. The great starting point is custom graze somebody else's cattle on somebody else's property. When you can make money doing that, then you buy the livestock. You run cattle that you own on somebody else's property. And when you make that work, then you can think about owning property yourself. But again, to me, land ownership is the reward for building a successful ranching business. Owning the land is not essential for getting started, and it is not essential for having a profitable business. The longer you can avoid it, the better off you would be. This shows the impact of, in essence, stocking rate on the overhead cost per cow. And we're just going to look at this total of them. So here we've already established this property would support 500 cows if we're managing it effectively. Right now, for whatever reason, we only have 50 cows on the property. Our overhead cost per cow is over $2,000. Well, let's see, our operating cost is $1,143. Here's our overheads at $2,000. Calves are worth a lot of money right now, but they're not worth $3,500, which is what it would take to pay both operating and overhead at that level. As we bring the ranch to a higher stocking rate, because we are managing it effectively and we are building the carrying capacity through good management choices, we get this total overhead over here, 500 cows on place, and we only have $300 in overheads per cow. And let's take that $1,800 revenue per cow that we were talking about earlier. If we have $300 overhead cost per cow, that's only 16%. That is a very, very good overhead ratio in a cow-calf operation. And I do know outfits, a number of them, on the plains and into the West, whose overhead cost per cow is $300 or less. But okay, I used the example yesterday of that McGinn Ranch in the Sandhills. That was the 8,964 acres where I said where they put in the big pipeline system, the fences, and in 3 years' time, doubled the carrying capacity of the ranch. Now, I said they didn't go from running 400 cows to 800 cows. They are running the equivalent of 800 cows, but the other 400 cows, they kept 400 cows, that was their base herd. That capacity, the forage consumption they're getting, that is the equivalent of 400 cows, that is being done entirely with custom graze enterprises. Why? Because he couldn't afford to buy 400, even 2014. Like I said, we did that project in 2014, 15, I think. So we were just past the peak. Maybe he could have afforded to buy, cows on the downside of that cattle cycle. I don't know that level. personal level of finances for him. But he made a choice that he would take all of that extra grazing capacity, harvest it with custom grazing enterprises, and avoid having to make that investment in 400 more cows. All right, so now we're going to start looking at how changes in operating costs and overhead costs can affect the bottom line of the business. So this is an old example. All the numbers in here are outdated, but they're such nice graphs, and I no longer have the program that makes graphs that are that nice. And so I don't update it and change it every time the market changes, because the basic principles that I'm talking about do not change. And Broken Hungry has the capacity of running 500 cows. Now, in this example, because I did this when I was young and foolish, I showed with previous table that as we go from 50 cows to 500 cows, that overheads actually are increasing. And so this line realistically should be gradually sloping upward. But we're just using it as a baseline here. We're saying whether we have any cows on this place or not, it's going to cost us $80,000 just for the privilege of having the ranch. From a labor standpoint, I talked about the American aspect yesterday in thinking about labor requirements for cow-calf herd. American Extension Service usually says 300 to 500 cows per full-time employee. I talked about Deseret at being at 1,000. I have here highly successful ranches in the U.S. greater than 800 cows per employee. The national standard in Australia, from their Bureau of Labor or whatever, the expectation is 1,500 animal units or cows per employee. On the really good, well-run outfits in Australia, 3,000 animal units per employee is expectation. Does that mean that Australian ranchers are that much better than American ranchers? No, it just means they have a completely different business model. So most of you, if you're out in the pasture and you find a cow that's having calving difficulty, what do? Well, you try to get the calf out of her alive. You try to get her to stand up, try to get the calf to get up and nurse. And, you just kind of hover around them and you work on it. Just got to save that calf, got to save that calf. You know what the Australians' idea of assisting a cow having a difficult birth is? Bam! And then you ride on. It's just a production unit. It wasn't Elsie or Bessie or anything like that. That was just a dysfunctional, that was a broken production unit. Let's put it in the junk heap. Oh man, that's kind of tough to tell our consumers, isn't it? But it's a different business model. In most of Australia, there is a small area of Australia that's temperate climate where they actually make some hay and feed some hay. But the vast majority of Australia, the very idea of making hay and feeding hay is foreign. So they never have that cost. So that's the difference. It isn't because they're better ranchers than we are. They operate in a very different business model than we do. This picture. This was at the Matador Ranch that was owned by the Koch brothers. Blacktail Valley, out east from Dillon, Montana. There's 3,600 cows in that herd. Most of the year, 2 men take care of this. Now, this is southwest Montana. Fed hay for 90 days over the last 40 years. And over half of that hay was in one winter. The winter, I believe it was 77, 78. It was either 77, 78 or 78, 79. For the most part, 2 guys, take care of it. That's 1,800 cows per employee. They ranch out on their own. For the most part, they graze year round. Rupert Murdoch actually owns this place now, not Koch brothers. But that is pretty good labor efficiency there. Do they have a 96% breed up rate and 92% live calf to the weaning pen rate? Probably not. But you know what? When I first visited this ranch in 2005, their cost to carry a cow was less than 50% of the national average. Their break-even cost of production for a weaned calf was 54 cents a pound. That's pretty good. Again, what I see all across the country, overcapitalization in equipment, especially small to medium-sized ranches. This is what really sinks the business. They own more equipment than what the cattle can pay for. Remember I mentioned that operation with 14,000 cows? That the only difference between it and the guy who had 29 cows was they lost way more money. The 14,000 cow operation. You know what the biggest killer in their business was? The fact that they owned 4 tractors, 4 balers, 4 swathers, 4 stackers, and all these other things. And they did do some no-till interseeding of stuff. And of course, they had 3 30-foot no-till drills. 14,000 cows, and they still couldn't pay for all that stuff. That was the biggest change, that they made in their business. Oh, and they dropped from 14,000 cows supported with harvested feed to 8,000 cows grazing year round and became a money-making business. So what is cow depreciation? It's the difference between the purchase price of that cow and the salvage price when she gets sold as a cull, spread over the number of calves she produces in her lifetime with interest charged. Because if you bought a cow, I know nobody in this room would do it, but some of your neighbors this summer have been buying $2,500, $3,000 cows. That's an investment made, and you want a return on your money. So we need to figure an appropriate interest rate for the time period that you have that $3,000 tied up in that animal. Okay, if you own a cow herd, you'll incur depreciation, therefore it is an overhead. That is the way a lot of the classic ag economists at the various land-grant universities look at this. Whether we're talking about K-State, University of Nebraska, University of Wyoming, if you look at how they're analyzing and budgeting things, they are usually putting this as a overhead. But we incur it every year because some percentage of the herd is getting culled and liquidated every year. So this is an ongoing every year process. And that is why I put it as an operating cost. We do tend to spend less per cow. And part of this is simply volume buying. You can buy stuff cheaper like mineral, salt, vaccines if you're dealing with 500 cows compared to 50 cows. Some of the day labor efficiencies come in here. But basically, as we go from our 50 cows to 500, the variable cost per cow is going to come down. Now, we set that line on top of the blue line. And at a low level of animals, we're spending $100,000. But by the time we get out here to the big herd, we're over $200,000 that we're spending. Now, I have this green line coming up, and this is calf revenue figured at $500 per cow annually. Oh boy, now you know how old this graph is and how out of date these numbers are. Well, we could take our $80,000 overhead and put it to the $150,000, that I showed in one of the tables, and we could put our variable costs at that $1,143 that LMIC showed for 2024. And then we have, $1,400 in cow cost. And if we bump that calf revenue up to $1,500, the picture would come out very similar to this one here. We have a certain level of overheads, we have a certain level of operating costs, and we can't make money. So if we were to reduce overheads by 25%, what happens? Well, this baseline here drops from 80,000 down to 60. And lo and behold, now our revenue line ends up being higher than the cost line. Yay, we've made money. The break-even herd size is now 420. So basically, we have the revenue from 80 cows now that's gone directly into the profit line. Well, that's pretty good. So you say, well, how are we going to reduce overhead by 25%? You don't have that list memorized, but I'll tell you that equipment depreciation was $20,000. So one of the ways we could reduce our overheads by 25% or $20,000 is get rid of that equipment. I mentioned Greg Simons yesterday, I believe. He was Burke Teichert's associate in the Deseret system. He was basically the segundo. He was the guy at the field level who forced everyone in those ranches to get on board with a different business model. And this is my favorite line from Greg. The only bad thing about ranching is farming. Get out of farming and it's better. And then at Ranching for Profit and their executive link program, this was a summary in one of the reports one year. The most profitable ranches in the Ranching for Profit executive link ranches are those with no farming operations. If you're going to be a rancher, be a rancher. Because being a farmer trying to ranch generally is not successful. Let the livestock do more of the harvesting, grazing, stockpiled pasture, rather than you mechanically harvesting it. Let the animals do it. Increase land use efficiency, get more out of every acre, and that's what management intensive grazing is about. Increase the productivity of our land through more effective management. The more pounds of beef that you can produce from any acre, it lowers the cost per pound of production for every one of those pounds, regardless of where we're on rangeland, high rainfall natural pasture, irrigated. That's the basic principle. You have associated or costs associated with an acre of land. Doesn't matter what kind of land it is. Yeah, those costs are going to be different, but every acre of land has a cost associated with it. If we can increase the output per acre in any of those situations through more effective management, it's going to lower our cost of production. So the impact of management, this is looking at the situation in Idaho where we were. So I had neighbors that I spied on. I knew how many cattle they ran from Google Earth photography. I could measure the size of the pasture. All I had to do was look out and see when the cattle arrived on that place, and either when they left or when they started feeding hay there. And I probably have a better record of what their production is than they do. And looking at 3 neighboring properties, basically 120 to 140 AUDs per acre. The ranch that we moved on to, the fellow who was managing, and we, as I think I mentioned, we lived on and managed 1 unit of a larger ranch system just in exchange for living on that property. So on this pivot here, from 1997 till 2004, so we arrived here in the fall of 2004, his 7 years of running that rotation, 3 to 5 day grazing periods. And so that was typically giving him about 28 to 35 days recovery. 185 cow days per acre is what he was averaging, which is about 2.7 tons to the acre. So he was getting 50% more per acre than what conventional management on the neighboring Now, my 18-year average on this property was 242. So the 2009 was a very good year, but I like to contrast what can be done. That's 4.7 tons to the acre. So 2.5 times more than what the neighboring properties were doing. Our best paddocks out there were over 400 AUDs per acre that year. And we invested in stock tanks, pipelines, and some permanent fencing, but we did most of the management with polywire fencing. And we did that in 2005 and 2006, the infrastructure development there. And we were under $30 an acre at that time when we did it. I recently did the same configuration using today's prices. And today it'd be about $120 an acre to make the same infrastructure. Increase labor efficiency, or reducing overheads, increasing labor efficiency. And so here we're going to say, all right, what happens if we reduce variable costs by $100 per cow? And that brings our variable costs down to this point, and our break-even herd size is now 265. And you might say, well, how are we going to save $100 per acre in variable costs, or $100 per cow? That is a very typical number that we see when people switch from primarily feeding hay to primarily stockpile grazing. Save $100+ per cow. So that's how we have now dropped our overhead cost by 25% because we got rid of our haying equipment. We've compensated for not having hay by more effectively grazing an extended season. And because we're not feeding hay, we're grazing, we've made that $100 in labor cost saving, let the cows harvest more of their own feed. And that brings us to starting to talk about stockpiling.